Well, I'm delighted to have been invited to introduce today's speaker and my good friend, Jim Griffin. Jim is a psychotherapist and a foster parent, and for the last 30 years, he and his wife have been opening their home to children in need of family support. So the context in which I have known Jim over the last 10 or more years is through the study and meditation groups that he has run at St. Cuthbert's Church in Hawick. Jim has a deep interest in the history and practice of meditation within the Christian tradition and the contemplative insights that meditation can bring. But he's also knowledgeable about other traditions. For example, I know that he taught Chinese philosophy in Hong Kong and he teaches Tai Chi. A central concern of Jim's is how the wisdom traditions of the past can help and inform us in meeting the challenges of the present, particularly the ecological and climate crisis of today. So I don't know that this will particularly come up into today's talk on Meister Eckhart, but I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what Jim has to tell us about Meister Eckhart and finding radical freedom. So thank you, Jim. Welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and I'm delighted to be here. So, Meister Eckhart, and I'm sure a good number of you are familiar with aspects of Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart, the man from whom God hid nothing. So goes one of his very early descriptions, and when we read Eckhart, I think what we find is that the concern with God is absolutely at the center of everything that he has to say. I think what I want to do is to provide a couple of quotations at the moment just to enable us to get started, to open up our minds into the kind of space that Eckhart operates from. And then a slightly backward step to go and situate Eckhart in his context. So to talk about where he came from, where he went, what he did, who his influences were, and so on. And then to come back into the meat of his teaching by looking at some of his key themes. So two initial areas of focus, if you like. The first is a statement from Thomas Aquinas, actually, from Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. And Aquinas was a huge influence in Eckhart's life and thinking. So I'll just give this quote and then a little comment on it. So Aquinas is speaking about intellect and reason. And intellect is one of the key terms in Eckhart's thinking. So Aquinas says, intellect and reason are not separate faculties. To know intellectually is to apprehend intelligible truth directly. To reason is to proceed from one understanding to another. Reason is compared to intellect as activity to rest, as acquiring to already having. One is a process, the other is an achievement. By intellect, a person is intent on things eternal, contemplating them in themselves, and consulting them for rules of action, while by reason, he is intent on things temporal. In the order of intellection, we judge of temporal matters according to eternal principles. Intellect and reason are distinguished by different habits and active functions. Unitive knowledge is attributed to intellect. Scientific or discursive knowledge is attributed to reason. So there are words already in this quote from Aquinas that are central to Eckhart. Eckhart wants us to know intellectually. He's not terribly interested in the process of reasoning, although he did write some tracts in Latin that were very much concerned with the process of reasoning. But his primary concern is that we focus intellectually, that we achieve something that he calls unitive knowledge, and that we acknowledge that our intellectual concern is with eternal matters, but more importantly, that our intellect itself is actually eternal. There is neither beginning nor end to our human intellect. That's a key teaching and insight of Eckhart's, and one that got him into a spot of bother from time to time, but that's nonetheless central to what he has to say. Eckhart could put things in very bold and at times for people disturbing ways. He was master of paradox. He would stretch our thinking to the absolute limits, and then ask us to step beyond those limits into an area where we can think no longer. So this is a couple of small quotes from Eckhart just now. I am my own cause according to my essence, which is eternal, and not according to my becoming, which is temporal. Therefore, I am unborn, and according to my unborn mode, I can never die. According to my unborn mode, I have eternally been, am now, and shall eternally remain. That which I am by virtue of birth must die and perish, for it is material, and so must perish with time. In my birth, all things were born, and I was the cause of myself and all things. And if I had willed it, I would not have been, and all things would not have been. If I were not, God would not have been either. And again on this, when I stood in my first cause, I had no God, and I was my own cause. Then I wanted nothing and desired nothing, for I was naked being and the knower of myself in the enjoyment of truth. So these are radical statements that Eckhart puts before us. As we'll see in a little while, they got him into quite a lot of trouble, but he stood by them. He stood by what he had to say. So I'll let those two statements rest with us just now. I want to step that back now from the immediate teaching and presentation of Eckhart's thought to situate him in his context. And that's important. I mean, that's really important. I mean, Eckhart was concerned with its eternity and with eternal truth, but he lived in a time and a place. And what was going on in that time and place had a huge impact on how he thought and what he had to say. So if I just situate him a little bit, he was born in 1260 and he died in 1328. He was then an exact contemporary with Dante. Dante was born in 1265, I think, and died in 1320 or thereabouts. So spanned the same period of time, but died a younger man than Meister Eckhart. And both of them were actually central in their respective cultures, in the Germanic and the Italian cultures, in terms of their relationship to their own culture and particularly their own language. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So Eckhart, at the age of 16, joined the Dominican order. So the order was named after its founder, St. Dominic. Its proper, if you like, name is the Order of Preachers. So a member of the Dominican order has the letters OP, Order of Preachers, Ordo Praedicantium, after their name. So he joined the Order of Preachers. And it's Eckhart as a preacher that I think I want to be particularly concerned with today. So the Dominicans were friars, and the other leading community and order of friars at that time was the Franciscans, and there was huge interplay and rivalry between these two orders. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. One of his closest friends at the time that he was writing, Aquinas' friends, was Bonaventure, who was a Franciscan. At the time of Eckhart's writing, two of his leading, I wouldn't say friends, but sparring partners were Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, who are both Franciscans. It's important to recognise what these orders of friars were, because they weren't monks, and the kind of theology and thinking and Christian reflection they engaged in was very different from the monastic reflection. If we think of the monastic orders, everything that flowed from the order of St. Benedict, for instance, these were men and women who dedicated themselves, amongst other things, to stability of life. They lived in one place, they lived in one community, they prayed in one community, they wrote and reflected in one community. The friars were quite the opposite. They were founded to move out into the world, to go out and teach and preach in universities, in schools, in parishes, in convents, in cathedrals. So they were engaged in the world, and the nature of the theology they engaged in was very different as a result. The Dominicans and the Franciscans espoused two different central viewpoints in their theologies around the idea of the purpose of human life and the goal of human life. So for the Dominicans, our beatitude, our ultimate joy and blessedness lay in knowledge, in knowing God, in the knowledge of God, the knowledge of the divine, the knowledge of the eternal. For the Franciscans, the primary focus was on love, and beatitude would be the experience of union in love with the divine. And it's very interesting if we put the point over to Dante in the Divine Comedy. Dante brings both of these strands of knowledge and love together. So that's a side thought, but a good one, I think, to bear in mind. But so with Eckhart, he has plenty to say about love in his sermons and teaching, but it is knowledge that he is primarily focused on. So he's a Dominican, and he lives in Germany. And it's the Dominican order in Germany that he joins. The Dominicans in Germany were very, very much influenced by the Neoplatonist strand of thinking within Christian thought. The two main strands at the time, as you'll probably all know, were the Neoplatonist strand and the relatively newly emerged Aristotelian strand. So, I mean, Eckhart marries both of these sets of teachings, the Aristotelian teachings, which he derived particularly from Aquinas in his Latin works, but very much the Neoplatonist in his German sermons. The other thing I was then saying before I disappeared was that Germany, and indeed the whole of Europe at that time, was in a ferment spiritually. There were new spiritual groups and spiritual teachings emerging, particularly in Germany, in the network of people now referred to as the Rhineland mystics, and associated with the women mystics in the order of the Begine. I'll talk about the Begines separately from now, but there was one member of the Begine order that we should make note of, not that she was German, she was Belgian and then lived and died in France, Marguerite Porete, who wrote a little book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, and some of her teaching is carried forward in Eckhart. I'm wondering how much more of a background I want to give before we get into the meat of Eckhart's work. Is that probably enough to help to situate him a little bit? And he studied and taught in Paris. He was a professor in Paris on a couple of separate occasions. The only other person to have the distinction of being invited twice as a professor to Paris in the Dominican order was Thomas Aquinas. He was then, for most of the time, a teacher in his order in Germany, and he was provincial of the German Dominicans. So he had major administrative responsibilities as well as teaching responsibilities, and he had the spiritual guidance of many of the Begine communities and many of the communities of nuns as his responsibilities. So he was active in a range of different spheres. So what do we want to say about his teaching? He presented God in a quite radical kind of a way. He presented God as primarily in terms of the Godhead, which he also referred to as the ground of being, of the ground of all reality. So Father, Son, and Spirit emerge from and return to the Godhead. So there's this movement within the Godhead. And within the Godhead also, we are all rooted through our intellect. Our intellect, which in Eckhart speaks about the soul, and the intellect is the apex, the high point of the human soul. So Eckhart described the life of the Godhead as a process of bullitio, a process of bubbling, of eternal energy, of flow and return and flow and return and flow and return. And that is the internal life of the divine. And the life of the human is a process of ebullitio, that there is a flowing out from the Godhead into that allows the emergence of the material world, the temporal world. And well, we have at the beginning of John's Gospel the expression, "In the beginning was the Word," and I think the word there for beginning in Greek is arche, and in Latin is principium. And what is being talked about, I think, is not so much a beginning as a foundation. And Eckhart picks up on this very strongly, that the foundation of everything lies within the Word, the divine Word. And what occurs in creation, what occurs through the mediation of the Word, is the created world. But it is a world where time exists within creation. Creation doesn't come to be in time. And I think this is really important to grasp what Eckhart is talking about when he's talking about eternity, because he's not talking about something that is separate from where we are, or that is a past in relation to our present. Eternity is the eternal now, and everything that is going on now is going on and happening even as we speak within eternity. There is no beginning and end to eternity, and in one sense there is no beginning and end to the process of creation. Creation occurs in eternity. What happens within creation is the emergence of time, and time then marks what we would call the developments, the differences, the difference between then and now, and will be the whole temporal flow, and also the spatial location of beings in one place or another for Eckhart. And he can only point to these realities rather than explicate them. We live in eternity primarily, which means we live in an eternal now, and we live in a single space, and all is present together within that space. What happens in our created existence is we forget that reality, we forget our eternal self, and we become immersed in the world of temporal change and creation. We take that in our ordinary run of things as being the primary reality, engaged with it, and we are attached to it. And in being attached in that way, we lose a sense of our eternal being. So one of the key points, and this is where the idea of radical freedom comes in that I was wanting to focus on. For Eckhart, freedom comes through the process of detachment. It comes through the process of an internal separation, an internal process of letting go. Detachment as Abgeschiedenheit is the word that he uses. A letting go of attachment to where we are and who we are in order to discover and live by our eternal being. I'll give you some lines from him just now on that. He, in one place, talks about one of his sermons. He's talking about about virginity, but he uses that word in his very particular way of meaning that point in ourselves which is pure and non-attached. So he says, by virgin, I mean a person who is free of all alien images, as free as he was when he was not. Observe that people may ask how a man who has been born and has advanced to the age of reason could be as free of all images as when he was nothing. He who knows so many things that are all images, how can he then be free? Keep in mind this distinction, which I want to make clear for you. If I were so rational that there were present in my reason all the images that all men had ever received, and those that are present in God himself, and if I could be without possessiveness in their regard, so that I had not seized possession upon any one of them, not in what I did or what I left undone, not looking to past or to future, but I stood in this present moment free and empty according to God's dearest will, performing it without ceasing, then truly I should be a virgin, as truly unimpeded by any images as I was when I was not. So even though we are in a world of objects, of persons, and of images, as he says, and in one sense we can't separate ourselves from them. That is the network of our living. What we can do is not be attached, is not hold on to them, is not identify ourselves with them, is not set them up as our goals. So he wants us to learn this is the whole focus and point of the spiritual life for Eckhart. It is to live without detachment, to live with detachment, without attachment to anything. And in that living, we live according to a different modality, which he refers to as Gelassenheit. So Gelassenheit is the process. The word means letting be, well, letting go and letting be. So we live by way of letting go of our attachments to the world, and we let then the world be according to its own identity. So the truth of what he's saying there is that insofar as we are attached to the world, then we distort the nature of the world by aligning it with our identity, with our being, with our needs and with our projects, rather than allowing it to be in itself whatever it is in itself. So Gelassenheit is a profound teaching, I think, in Eckhart, letting the world be what it is without relating that world to ourselves and to our own goals and projects. So a little bit more about what he has to say in this area of attachment. Every attachment to every work deprives one of the freedom to wait upon God in the present and to follow him alone in the light with which he would guide you in what to do and what to leave alone, free and renewed in every present moment, as if this were all that you had ever had or wanted or could do. And it is only within that living there in relation to God in that profound and radical way that he says, our soul produces no fruit unless it performs the work to which we have been so attached and have entrusted ourselves not in God, but in ourselves. We will not be free until we have performed that work on which we are seized without possessiveness. If we cannot achieve that state of being without possessiveness, then we have no peace. So this sense of attachment, or the need for detachment, he presents right across the spectrum of human engagement. And he presents it particularly in relation to the engagement with the spiritual life. He was, for instance, very critical of anyone who wanted, first of all, to mark their progress, if we call it that, in the spiritual life, or who thought that they could do things, whether by way either of penitential exercises, fasting, and such like, or by way of works of mercy, like kindness and generosity, and alleviating the plight of the poor. If we identified those engagements as being part of our spiritual progress and process, then we were placing those engagements between ourselves and God. These engagements, even the most refined of them spiritually, would be attachments. They would be part of our ego and part of our ego's project. So we are still tied. We are still tied by our own spiritual ambitions. To let go of all of that, there is a paradox here because, of course, Eckhart was a member of a religious order that had a whole range of spiritual practices available to it. He was a supervisor and a guide for members of religious community who had a whole set of religious practices and spiritual practices available to them. So he was presenting a truth that was very hard for people to hear. It was an absolute uprooting of the ego from its deepest grip and holding. But the point he would make, I think, would be, well, if we were to imagine a bird tethered by a steel chain or tethered by a silk thread, it wouldn't matter what the tethering amounted to. In either case, the bird was tethered and unable to fly. The bird had no freedom. So even the most refined kind of attachment is still an attachment that needs to be identified and overcome. And I don't think for 1 minute he thinks that's an easy task. There's a Sufi story, I'm not sure that I can remember all of it, but part of the process of trying to identify the depths of holding on in the nafs, in the egoic self, and the image that's used in terms of trying to find the depths of that holding on, trying to track down the traces, the last traces of the nafs, is that it's like trying to identify or catch a black beetle on a black stone on a moonless night. So a pretty much seemingly impossible task, but both of these teachings, whether with Eckhart or whether the Sufis, are identifying the same thing. And we need to hear them, Eckhart would say, and he's constantly, in his sermons, he's constantly saying to his audience, hear this, hear what I'm saying to you just now. And he's saying that to people by use of a kind of language that is riddled with paradox. Michael Sells wrote a book on mysticism. Some of you will probably know Michael Sells' work, primarily in relation to Ibn Arabi, but he wrote a lovely book called, I think, Languages of Unsaying, which is about the way in which mystical thinkers in different traditions try to unsay the language of their spiritual tradition, not to present information, not to present guidance in it in one sense, but to undo it, to take it apart, to point out that this language doesn't work when we're talking about ultimate reality. It doesn't allow us to say what we think we are saying. I had a theologian friend once who talked about the difficulty in speaking about God. And he said, speaking about God is like throwing mud at the sky in the hope that some of it sticks. And I think Michael Sells is saying the same thing. And I think that's the point that Eckhart is trying to get across in his sermons. And so we have to read him as someone committed to the use of paradox in his language, to the use of provocation in his language, because what he's wanting, he's not wanting to impart information. He's wanting to wake people up. And in that respect, I mean, there have often been comparisons between Eckhart and other thinkers of the Eastern traditions. He's very, very much akin to the Koan tradition in Zen Buddhism, where it is the use of riddling sayings by the Zen teachers that don't impart information at all, but are ways of goading and prodding the person on the spiritual journey. Wake up now. It's not what you think it is. So this waking up is what Eckhart wants to bring people to. And when we awake, we are free. Now, there is a paradox here, because to engage in the process of trying to wake up, we have to try and follow a path. But we have to give up any attachment to that path. And we also have to recognize that whatever occurs on that path is nothing to do with our own doing. It is entirely grace. It is entirely God-given. And that's what I think Eckhart wants to say finally at the end. What we come to, the freedom that we find, is a God-given freedom. We may think we found it, but it's God-given. Even when we talk about creating space for God to be present in our lives, insofar as I am creating a space, I am doing a work, and I am attached. So even that, what we would call, and it's a well-known trope within spiritual practice, that we might try in our spiritual lives to create space for God to be with us. That also, though, is one of our works, and we have to let that go and let God be God and allow the grace of God to work in us. And when we have that, I'll give you a few more lines from Eckhart to focus some of these things. So he says, I mean, some of these things that I'm reading now come from one of his very famous sermons, a sermon on poverty. And by poverty, he also means freedom. By poverty, he means that radical detachment which has given up holding on to anything, which is poor, which is empty, and in that emptiness is free. For a man to possess true poverty, he must stand as free of his created will as he did when he was not. If a man is to be poor of will, he must will and desire as little as he willed and desired when he was not. The poor man is not he who wants to fulfill the will of God, but he who lives in such a way as to be free of his own will and of God's will, as he was when he was not. In some of this language about not being, not knowing, being ignorant, there is a thought that Eckhart might have been exposed somewhat to the thought of Marguerite Perret. And this is a little saying from her writing, The Mirror of Simple Souls, which is quite close to what he has to say. This soul, who has become nothing, thus possesses everything, and so possesses nothing. She wills everything, and she wills nothing. She knows all, and she knows nothing. So it's riddling, it's paradoxical. It's trying to bring us to the edge of what we can possibly think in order to let go of our thinking. He says again, let us pray to God that we may be free of God, that we may gain the truth and enjoy it eternally, there where the highest angel, the fly, and the soul are equal, there where I stood and wanted what I was, and was what I wanted. So all of this is being presented in German, in a newly coined use of language. Eckhart is often spoken of as the founder of the German language and also the founder of German philosophy, the father of German philosophy. These were the first major forms of teaching that were presented to people in the vernacular in Germany. Marguerite Porete was one of those doing a similar kind of work in France, in French. And I mean, the whole movement into the vernacular, you have the same with Dante writing in the vernacular in Italy, was the crucial thing that was going on at the time, and making all of these thoughts available to people who weren't part of the narrow scholastic world of the universities, where everything was written in or spoken in a very precise Latin and a multiply differentiated kind of Latin. He was speaking in the ordinary language, the richness of the ordinary language. But he felt that these extraordinary truths that he was putting across were available to ordinary people. He wasn't speaking to privileged university audiences when he was preaching his sermons. He was preaching in churches and cathedrals and religious communities. And he allowed, I think, that people could grasp and understand what he was saying from their own position, from their own perspective. I'll give one last thing just to finish him off. There's much more that we could say, but I would prefer, particularly with the disruptions there have been, to let some of that come out in the question and answer just in a minute. So what do we have? So again, this is one of his sayings from this sermon on poverty. When I flowed forth from God, all creatures declared, there is a God. But this cannot make me blessed. For with this knowledge, I acknowledge myself as a creature. But in my breaking through, where I stand free of my own will, of God's will, of all his works and of God himself, then I am above all creatures and am neither God nor creatures, but I am that which I was and shall remain forevermore. There I shall receive an imprint that will raise me above all the angels. So this is the final word of his that I think is quite crucial, this talking about breaking through, that the kind of knowledge he brings us to, the kind of awareness that he brings us to, is a breaking through to something. It is an enlightenment that he is after. And from that sense of enlightenment, from that breakthrough, we see things in a radically different way. We see things, we see ourselves, we see the world as coming from the hand of God, constantly, eternally, in an ever-present now. But in another paradoxical sense, we no longer think about God. What we do is we live our life within the world. We live our life not seeking. We live without a why. As he said, we're no longer seeking for knowledge or for explanation. We live by grace openly in the world and engaged in the world. So he's not, again, putting forward a spirituality of retreat and withdrawal and departure in the way that might be true of the monastic traditions. He's putting forward a spirituality of engagement, but a detached engagement. Okay, I think I'll leave the presentation there so that we can engage in some conversation together.
First question. This is from Gary Sprandell. Is there a relationship between transcendence and detachment?
I think it would depend on what one was meaning by transcendence. What Eckhart is after with detachment is that we stop putting ourselves in the picture. But what we stop putting in the picture is our limited and creative self. And so when we stop putting that self in the picture, when we stop worrying about our spiritual progress or our salvation or our identity or the nature of God, when we stop pursuing questions like that, then we are living or beginning to live according to the eternal knowledge that we already possess. It's not that we're acquiring anything in terms of this knowledge. We possess this knowledge already. It is opening ourselves up to it and letting ourselves live within it. And this knowledge is grace, according to Eckhart. It's not something of our own achievement. It is an opening, a God-given opening to the depths of ourselves that are always present with God. Now, if by transcendence we mean being always present with God, living from that foundation of our being in God, if that's what we mean by transcendence, then detachment is the path to that transcendence. But the gift of transcendence is always a gift. So there's the dilemma, the paradox that he's trying. He's not wanting to say step off the spiritual path and do nothing. He is wanting to say, if you're on the spiritual path, don't think that what you're doing is getting you anywhere, because where you get to is simply gift.
Okay, thank you. Next one, we're probably going to need a few definitions here from M. Ali Lakhani. Thanks, Jim. You spoke of the way of knowledge and the way of love. It appears that Eckhart emphasized apophasis more than cataphasis. Where do you think he lies on that spectrum? Perhaps a few definitions.
Okay. I'll elaborate the terms and so on. So within the traditions of theology, ways of talking about God and the divine were usually identified as being either cataphatic. These are Greek terms, cataphatic and apophatic. These are Greek terms. Cataphatic means the ability to make positive statements about God. So positive theology. So that we can say that God is good, God is kind, God is generous, God is merciful, God is all loving. All of these positive statements. That's saying things and thinking about God in that way. That's a cataphatic theology. Apophatic theology is the language of unsaying. God is not this. God is not good. God is not powerful. God is not loving. God is not merciful. The apophatic language being used to make clear that we cannot use human language of God. God is always mystery, and so we, insofar as we use human language of God, we need to take it away again. We need to unsay it, because it gives us the illusion that by speaking positively of God, we have identified something about God that our minds are capable of identifying. Apophatic theology says, well, our minds are capable of identifying nothing about God. God is the ultimate mystery that is beyond our minds and beyond language. Now, there is a paradox here, because, of course, Eckhart is wanting to say that our minds, insofar as we are intellect, are rooted in the divine from all eternity. But language is a human construct in the temporal world. So we can't use language to grasp eternity in that way. So the apophatic approach emphasizes that point. Now, these terms in the Latin theology, you have the via negativa, which is apophatic, which is the taking away of words, the language of unsaying, and you have the via positiva, making positive statements about God. But there is a third way in the Latin tradition, the via eminentiae, which is the language of more than. Whatever we say about God by using human language, God is always more than whatever we might be able to say. And you get some of that more than language in Eckhart, but yes, you're right in the question, his predominant language, because he sees it. Chogyam Trungpa wrote a book called Spiritual Materialism, and I think that's what Eckhart is wanting to get rid of. So anything that allows us to treat the spiritual world as something material that we can grasp, we can hold on to, we can make positive statements about, that was within our control, he's wanting to say no to that. And so he's saying no, 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 nothing, 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 nada, 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 as John of the Cross would say. So a rather long answer to your question, but I hope that clarifies.
I'll read out Neil's question. It's quite long. In a recent new publication, I read about Zen Master Dogen Zenji, is that? The author brought the teachings into the present by likening him and his writing and practice to the works of John Coltrane, Picasso, and Jimi Hendrix. Are there any people from recent and current generations that you would say might reflect some of what Eckhart represents?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I mean, people have linked Eckhart with not John Coltrane, John Cage, and a sort of minimalist approach, a minimalist use of language and the use of silence. And there is, within the world of philosophy, there is an important link with the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger and other German philosophers through the centuries, they look back to Eckhart as a foundational figure for the German philosophical tradition. And Heidegger made extensive use of the terminology of Gelassenheit in his later philosophy. So Heidegger also, in different context from Meister Eckhart, was wanting to bring in this notion, he wanting to take apart the idea of the will, and that we will to do things, we achieve things in the world by willing, by programs of action and engagement. And he was wanting to undo the idea of the will and replace it with the terminology of Gelassenheit, of letting the world be in its own place, and understanding it from its own perspective rather than from ours. Anyone else on Eckhart? No, I think that's a really interesting question, and my engagement has been more often with medievals, so I'll take some time to think about that and maybe put in a written comment to Michael at some point about what links I find. Yeah.
I will. We have a question from Gary. Is there any evidence of contact with Jalaluddin Rumi? If I heard right, I think was a contemporary of Meister Eckhart.
No evidence of contact. No, I mean, people have tried to pursue these lines of contact with both Eckhart and with Dante in relation to Rumi and to Ibn Arabi. With Dante in particular, because of the language of love that he uses, which has affinities with both Rumi and Ibn Arabi. Eckhart would be more readily linked, I think, with Ibn Arabi than he would with Rumi if you wanted to look at moderately comparable figures. And that was part of the work, I'm sure, in the early days of Bashara, under the guidance of Dom Sylvester Huddard, who, in his little book on Eckhart's sermons, which I think is a very good commentary on some of the sermons, I mean, he's constantly making comparisons with Ibn Arabi and Eckhart. But in terms of, if you're talking about influence, these are very difficult things to work out. I mean, there was certainly a great deal of exchange between the Arabic and Muslim worlds and the Christian world, between the Christian world and the Jewish world. Eckhart read extensively in Maimonides and drew upon Maimonides' thought, and in Avicenna and drew upon his thought. There's no evidence that he was in any way aware of Ibn Arabi or of Rumi. That's a very interesting point. All of the Latin scholastics were aware of Averroes. In terms of Aquinas, for instance, Aquinas said that the philosopher was Aristotle and the commentator was Averroes. So all of the Latin thinkers, including Eckhart, made use of the commentaries of Averroes on the text of Aristotle. So that is true also, and thank you for bringing that in. That's a constant thread running through. And yes, I won't say any more about that. But Ibn Arabi himself, or Rumi himself, very difficult from my knowledge so far to find any direct links or exchange of ideas.
Edward Gay has the following question. Does Eckhart's concept of detachment mirror the concept of sunyata in Buddhism? And he says Krishnamurti talks about not following a spiritual path because the knowledge is already within us. So we don't need a path to seek it, just an awakening to what's already there.
Yeah. I think Eckhart would say something quite similar, but also would say that it's a rare bird like Krishnamurti that can live without a path, and that he was constantly engaging with people, and indeed in his own training as a Dominican was being provided with one or another path to awaken to the presence of God in one's life. So Eckhart was involved in this twofold practice of identifying aspects of a path and then denying that they could achieve what they set out to achieve. In terms of his own freedom and personal independence, I think actually Krishnamurti wouldn't be a bad comparison. In terms of the term sunyata, I think it's a word that could be well used of the realm of eternity, if you like, that Eckhart is trying to identify. And sunyata was a central term in Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, enabling people to identify the world in terms of emptiness and formlessness and instability and impermanence. And then you see, though, there was this shift that was needed from using sunyata as a philosophical term to achieving an experience of enlightenment, if you say within the Zen Koan tradition, that meant we didn't just use sunyata philosophically, but that it was the foundation of our actual awareness, that we lived within that enlightened sense of the world as empty within itself.
Okay, thank you. Bruni Schilling, let me invite you to unmute again. You want to say something about Eckhart and the German language?
Yes. Jim made the statement that Meister Eckhart started the German language or founded it, which is a bit of an oversimplification. If I may correct this a bit. Yeah. What Meister Eckhart did, I mean, there was a German courtly culture, courtly literature around, courtly epics, the Nibelungenlied, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, and all those things had been written by that time. But what Meister Eckhart did by transferring a lot of Latin thought into the vernacular, he actually invented words like the Latin communi into Gemeinde, etc. So he was a great innovator and creator of the German language, which very much started a tradition in Germany, that of an interiority and inwardness which carried forth through various philosophers, poets, etc., to Heidegger. That's what I wanted to say. And I recently got interested in Owen Barfield through Mark Vernon's book, The Secret History of Christianity. And I have read Meister Eckhart in Middle High German, in the original medieval, and just listening to his words in English, in the Latin, like foundations, which is a Grund in Middle High German, which is an unfathomable word in a way, or etc. So I could see when I read Meister Eckhart, which is something which will be lost in any translation, he is opening up through his unsystematic, challenging, paradox ways, areas of experience, which it's the poetry of his language in itself, not just the thought, which jolts you out of the discursive thinking.
Lovely. Thank you.
Could I ask you, at the end of your talk, which thank you very much, it's very enlightening, he does say, I can't remember how you put it, but the sort of shocking thing of, in a way, of going, was it beyond God?
Yeah.
Now, is he talking about God in the beliefs, or is, like, or beyond Godhead as he described it with the Father, Son, and Spirit, I think you said. So it sounded, it's quite a sort of bold statement. So could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, I think he's in the line of what the first part of what you're saying, that he's wanting to get us is not just beyond the language about God, but it's also, our attachment to God might be the last attachment we need to get rid of. I think that's what he's after. So he's not making a positive statement about the existence or non-existence of God or the Trinity or the Godhead or whatever. He's making statements about our attachment and about the harm that we do to ourselves, even by being attached to the name of God, even by being attached to living a godly life, even by being attached to doing the works of God. All of these ways of speaking about God, insofar as they come from our attachment, are a barrier. And so that's why he says, let go of all of that. Become invisible. Become invisible in the world. Do not stand up on a soapbox saying, I'm here to tell you about God, although he does it in the cathedral, in the pulpit. But he's undoing himself all of the time. He's doing something and then contradicting it, trying to undo himself. But I think his model of how to be in the world would be like, the stories of the great saints, the pillars who uphold the world, but are invisible. They just do it. They don't do it by reference to God. They just do it because it's a welling up from within their own being. And I think that's the key also, that it's not just that bullitio is the inner life of the Godhead. Bullitio is our inner life because we are part of the Godhead. And it's that welling up within ourselves, within our mind and heart, that he wants to create space for.
What does Meister Eckhart give us in terms of practicals of letting the world be? What kind of practical tips does he talk about?
If I try and situate him, first of all, in his own world, and his own world has, his own Christian world at that point, has very curious, his cultural world, his cultural Christian world, has a very curious relationship with what we might call created reality. Eckhart, on more than one occasion, refers to our existence in the world as being a state of exile, so that we have come from our true world, which is the world of spirits, the world of the divine, into the material world by some process, by some process of creation, but he doesn't say more than that. We find ourselves in this created world. And for him, we experience this as a state of exile. And so the idea is to free ourselves from it with a view to returning to our original home. Now, that has a twofold aspect: returning to our original home now, insofar as it is the very foundation of who we are, and returning to our original home post-mortem, if you like, that after death we will be able to live again simply in eternal reality rather than in temporal reality. So there is not with him any kind of philosophy of building up the world, any kind of philosophy that sees the world. He would talk about the world as being God's good creation. He would talk about the world, and he would see it as being inherently good. He would talk about the evil in the world according to the traditional language, evil being a privatio boni, being an absence of the good. The creation is always good. What seems to us to be evil is an absence of the good that should be there. He was speaking that kind of a way. But I don't think you find in him, as you wouldn't in many other Christian thinkers of the time, there being any particular point or purpose to created reality. It's not, the created universe is not on a journey anywhere. It simply is. So we have to live within that world that simply is. And he talks about, but he's asked on one occasion about the value of certain kinds of spiritual practices, and for living in the world, is it good to engage in penitential practices, fasting, wearing hair shirts, depriving ourselves of sleep, all of these ways that every tradition identifies as an early stage of practice. And he says, no, it's better to leave that kind of thing alone. Much better is the path of love, that we learn to live out of love for our neighbour. But I think that's really as far as he goes. It's a kind of neighbourliness, and we should live in a neighbourly way. But even there, we need to let that path go if we are to live simply from this ebullitio, this welling up of godliness within ourselves. So if we try to apply Eckhart to today, we live in a very different universe. We live in a universe that, well, I don't know about everyone here, but most people would see as the universe engaged in some process of evolution. We would see humankind over billions of years being part of some process of evolution. And we would see, if we come from a divine perspective, seeing that whole process as perhaps bringing something into the life of the divine. Someone like Teilhard de Chardin would say that very strongly. So if we try to situate Eckhart in relation to that kind of thinking, I think he would again emphasize that at the heart of that kind of thinking, we have to have detachment. It is our false attachments to Elon Musk wanting to go off into outer space, or Richard Branson wanting to go off into outer space, or Stephen Hawking saying, the planet is finished and we need to go off and inhabit other planets in order to fulfill our projects. Eckhart would say in relation to all of that, let go, detach. These are vanity projects. These are projects of attachment. How do we live unattached in a world that is developing in some way, or that is, and even that's too optimistic a kind of statement, because we're living in a world of catastrophe, and it is our attachment to so many different things through industrialization and so on. It's our attachment to the way of life that has brought about that is creating that catastrophe. So again, he would say, I think detachment is at the heart of what he says. If we live, it's not just that we need to stop doing things always in reference to ourselves, but that if we live detached, everything actually looks different. It doesn't look the same as if we are seeing it in relation to ourselves or as fulfilling some of our projects. It looks like it should look if we allow it its own life and its own existence.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, a really important one.
And Elizabeth has her hand up. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Hi, Jim.
Hello.
It's very interesting what you're saying about detachment, because this is just what we've been looking at in the Bhagavad Gita and thinking about this subject of detachment, which can sound a bit cold and indifferent and maybe not terribly appealing. And one of a quotation that I came across from St. John of the Cross said, he asked this question, how is it that we can detach? And he said, the only way that we can let go of all the things that delight our will, that delight our self-will, is by being attached, having a greater fire and a nobler love and something greater that we are attached to. And it's only by having that something greater that, it's like these other attachments fall away. Does Meister Eckhart say anything like that?
I think he would say that that's a stage on the path. You get a similar, but I think Eckhart has caught up with the same kind of paradox that you get within Buddhism, which is very close to what you're raising there. The process of, if you like, in early Buddhism, let's put it this way, in terms of attaining nirvana, desiring nirvana. Well, how can one desire nirvana? Because the problem in human life is desiring. This is, for the Buddha, the problem that frustrates us and creates all the disasters that we live with personally, is that we are always desiring, we are always wanting, we are always seeking. So we need to let go of that. Now, you can say then, well, the desire for nirvana is, if you like, a higher level desire. It regulates, there's a desire, that nirvana literally means blowing out. It means blowing out the fires of attachment. So if we desire nirvana, that is a way of helping us to blow out all of these other fires. But eventually we have to let go of nirvana. Otherwise, nirvana becomes the ultimate. It becomes the silk thread that tethers the bird. Ultimately, you have to cut the silk, as well as saying goodbye to nirvana, as well as saying goodbye to our desire for ultimate bliss. And I think that's a paradox that he's working with. Desire for ultimate bliss or so on can lead to some very unpleasant consequences. As we've seen through movements from the 60s onwards. So I think we have to live with that paradox. I think putting in a regulatory principle that we attach ourselves to in order to free ourselves from lesser attachments still means that at some point we need to give up the attachment to the regulatory principle, the goal, the perfection, or whatever. And it's not miserable. It's not miserable because, he's bubbling. Eckhart is bubbling. He's a man full of joy. Joy comes up regularly in his sermons. It's not as if he's a miserable old stoat, preaching sackcloth and ashes and woe, let go of it all because we're all doomed anyway. It's nothing like that.
Bruni, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I would like to go back to the question about God. Eckhart also said that God saved him from God, one of his paradoxical statements. Yeah. And which I find very, very nice. And then he also makes linguistically the distinction between Godhead and God. Yeah. Godhead is that which gave rise to God before God was God. And he says that before God was God. And at that stage, we are basically one and undifferentiated with God and come out into the world. And another comment I would want to make about the practical application. He stands, I believe, they're very much in the Augustinian tradition, that once you are saved, as Augustine would say, or once God is in you, you will do good. Or Luther later on, that not the good works make the good person, but the good person does the good work. And you cannot do anything but doing good works.
Yes, I mean, one of Augustine's difficult sayings for a lot of people would be "Amor et fac quod vult," or volis, love and do what you will, on the assumption that that love will not lead you into wrongdoing of any sort, because it is love. Because it is love. So I think, they're in the same path, boat, place, whatever there that you want to say. But to go back to the idea of the Godhead, the Godhead was before God. Well, what do we do with that word "was"? Because this is a temporal word.
Yes, of course. I agree.
Well, even is a problem, because, I mean, we're talking about a process that is now and always was and always will be, whatever, however we put it. So God is emerging from the Godhead, and the Trinity is emerging from the Godhead constantly. It's a constant bullitio. It's not as if one happens before the other. That's the only way we can talk about it with our language, because we are temporal beings. But within eternity, there is no temporality. There is no before or after.
Like bearing Christ all the time in the soul. Christ is constantly born in us. Constantly born, all the time. The birth of this is another of his big themes, the birth of Christ in the soul. But this is, as you say, this is the eternal process going on now, and will always go on. Mm. This is why we have to use an apophatic language, because it is beyond our temporally constrained minds and use of language. We can point in a direction. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a comment in the chat, again from Ali Lakhani, which I'll read. It goes back to the previous question. I think we're talking about detachment. In Islam, the world is theophany, created from love and for love. It is not purposeless. He's talking about, talking about the purpose of creation. I think it's a relation to that. The aim of detachment is a type of emptying, for nafila, for fulfillment, bakabila. The world of signs, ayat, reminds us of this in terms of the way, as Frithjof Schuon puts it. The saint is the void made for the passage of God. Lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay. I don't know if you want to say anything more on that. Lovely.
No,
anyway,
I think in my reading of it, and I'm not I read to an extent within Ibn Arabi, but I'm not not any kind of an expert. But I think the language of the world there, and the world as transparent to God, and the world as the overflowing bounty of God, and so on, is much more richly elaborated than it would be within Eckhart. But it is pretty richly elaborated also in earlier strands, in some of the monastic strands of Christian thinking. That's what I would say there, I think.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for that. Fadi.
I have a bit of a query that, from what I understand, that Meister Eckhart kind of relied on realization of detachment. Like we need to kind of almost like make a decision to detach, perhaps, and arrive at the state of non-detachment, but without giving emphasis on the path. But from my understanding, the religious traditions generally, they put a path not for the sake of realization as much as for the sake of managing the human emotions, which are sometimes too strong that can overrule the realization. That realization on its own is not enough. Sometimes desire and hate or rage, anger, even with the realization, can sometimes overpower the human being. And so they put some sort of practices, let's say meditation, to build up resilience towards these kind of emotions. And I'm wondering, does he devise or kind of encourage or anything like that, some sort of a practice of a path, or how to manage these strong emotions?
I think he would say that there are various of these paths already available. And speaking as Eckhart, I don't want to create another path. These paths are there already, and people are following these paths, whether it be a Franciscan path or a Dominican path, or the path of the Beguine, the holy women who are living in small communities. These paths exist. People follow them. I want to talk about things that happen at a later stage in the path, if you like. A traditional Christian view of the spiritual path would be to identify three stages, or the stage of purification, the stage of illumination, and the stage of union. So what you're talking about there, the state and the state of purification, that's always a requirement. You're right. You know, we have demons that can take over if we don't allow ourselves to know them and to purify their presence and action within us. Not to necessarily let go. I mean, anger can be a powerful, liberating emotion if we know how to use it and to focus it. So it's not to wipe it all out. It's not to wipe our emotional being out, but to become detached from it and to recognize it from what it is. So there are always these practices of purification. And then as these practices are followed, states of illumination will emerge. This is not to do with book study. It is to do with an awareness or an expansion of our minds occurring progressively, the less that we are crowded out by our negative feelings and jealousies and prejudices and so on. So our minds expand, they become larger, they become more capable of embracing the world. And then within that process of illumination, we also become more aware of the divine ground within us, and we become more united with it. Now, so those would be three aspects. Now, Eckhart wants to remind us that we are always united with the divine ground, and our attachments get in the way of knowing that. So you're right, we do have to find ways of letting go. We do have to recognize the distortion that the dangerous emotions can lead to. So we have to recognize that. We have to become aware progressively that we are in the grip of distortions, and we have to find ways of transforming those distortions, letting go of them, and so on, becoming more illuminated, more enlightened, and then at the same time becoming more aware of the unitive ground of our being with the divine. In one or two rare occasions, Eckhart speaks of that union with the divine in terms of what's another strand in Christian mysticism, a kind of bridal mysticism, the kiss of the soul, that the closer we get to God, we experience being kissed by God. It was a very racy kind of image, and within that kissing, God places in our mouth the divine word. Now, that's a very unusual kind of thing in Eckhart. There are other traditions of Christian mysticism who make strong use of the idea of the divine kiss, but it is there with him. Was Eckhart a mystic? That's another question also as well. And I'm using the word mystic just now of him, talking about mysticism. One commentator, and I think this is the best description of him, describes him as a contemplative metaphysician, if that's not too grand a term, but I mean, I think he's very much a thinker. He's very much a thinker in all of this, whilst at the same time wanting to deny his own thinking, not wanting to give it too much status or credence. Thank you for that question.
Well, thank you very much. But I mean, I've found it extraordinarily interesting and enjoyable. I think everybody has, despite the glitches at the beginning. So thank you again. It's been a lovely session. And
thank you, everyone, as well, from my side.
Thank you.